This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and we have a great show planned today where we're going to talk about boardroom and leadership trends. And I can't think of a better guest to have to deal with that issue than our guest for today. Let me introduce Rodgin Cohen, who's the senior chairman of Sullivan and Cromwell. And Raj, you and I go back quite a ways with this. When we started, the boardroom looked very, very different.
Indeed it did.
Yep, than it does today. But I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have us back and have you on the show and have us talk about some of these issues.
Pleasure's mine.
Well, let's start with that idea of looking back a little
Sure.
bit. I think that's a good place. And you've been, you'd have to be labeled as one of the deans of board advisors, and you've been in as many boardrooms as anybody has. So sort of give your feeling of how the boardroom has changed, say, in the last 15 years.
Sure. The change has not been revolutionary. It has been evolutionary, but the evolution has been quite substantial. I think today you have a boardroom where the individual members are much more committed, are taking much more time, are much more engaged, are much more familiar with the package of board material before them, but also the company they are on the board of and with respect to the industry generally. If I could sum it up, 15 years ago, this was an honor to be on the board. Not a lot of work, and you got paid. Today, it is maybe not a full-time job. It can't be, and that's got to be understood, but it is a substantial commitment of time and effort to be on a board and to be a good director. I think there's one other major change. My partner Glenn Schleier and I have spent a lot of time talking about and then writing about the situation where at one time the board was clearly dominant versus the shareholder. Today that has changed, so if anyone is dominant, it is the shareholder base rather than the board. And so that creates a different dynamic in the boardroom.
Yeah, I guess we'd have to say that in addition to the board changing, the shareholders and investors have changed as well.
Exactly, and the boards have to be responsive to that change.
Yeah, there was a time where I would tell the boards to just do what's right, but today you've really had to change that into the context of do what's right, but don't be insensitive to sort of what's going on around from the shareholder perspective.
I think that is well said, because if you're not sensitive, you won't have the opportunity to do what's right because you're not going to be reelected.
Yeah. Well, when we look back, to me, one of the most significant changes to me is sort of the role of the chairman, or maybe better put, because you also have the lead director, is the role of board leadership. And that to me has been one of the significant changes or evolution as you talk about it. And the interesting part is I don't think that it's ever going to be permanent. I think it's constantly being fleshed out. And we really see that today with the shareholder engagement and communication that's necessary. Do you have the same experience over your time as far as leadership goes?
Absolutely. Certainly if there is a chairman or lead director that is independent, in the case of the chairman, from the CEO, that individual is taking a much more significant role in the boardroom than in the past, and as you point out, with shareholders. But you raise an interesting point, which is that the actual responsibility of, let's say, the lead director, presiding director, call him what you will, has not been fleshed out. And I'm not sure it makes sense to flesh it out and to put the responsibilities and duties within clearly calibrated silos, because each company is different, each shareholder base is different, and from time to time, even within the same company, the responsibilities of the lead director may change. If, for example, you have an activist shareholder, the lead director may need to take a more upfront role. But this also explains why the whole debate is between whether you should split the chairman and CEO. It's just not a virtue either way. You can find some major companies which failed after splitting the chairman and CEO. So neither is a recipe for success. It's what counts in the individual company.
Well, let me switch gears just a little bit and once again tap your experience. I think in the many, many years that I've known you, I would have to say that you might be best known for your M&A work and what you've done with some of the world's largest companies. And when we look at what's happening with all companies going global and going into multiple countries and with multiple businesses, we see the world becoming much, much smaller. At the same time, the complexity of going into these countries and meeting the cultures and the laws of these countries and then finding the talent has to put pressure not only on the company but on the board to oversee all that's going on. So when you look at that paradigm change happening, what do you think is the biggest challenge for directors in sort of that growth cycle?
Well, first of all, I agree fully with your observation. The world is getting smaller and more complex at the same time, and that may seem like a contradiction, but in fact it's reality. I think there are probably a couple of challenges. Number one is the importance of compliance. It's difficult enough in the United States as standards change and it's not clear exactly what the new standards are. But when you are involved in multiple countries around the world which have different compliance regimes, different cultures, the difficulty of being compliant is just compounded exponentially. And so the function of compliance is really critical. The second aspect is relates to an element of diversity. What I think you want in the boardroom is a set of diverse experiences which are compatible with where you are in the world. So to have a boardroom for a multinational corporation where every director is American and has not traveled extensively or run a company outside the United States or had other involvement outside the United States, you don't have the diversity in the boardroom which meets the diversity of the company. And to achieve some level of coherence between those two paradigms is important.
You have that, it's interesting because as you were talking, you have that same challenge. That's the challenge sort of geographically. You have that same challenge technology-wise on what's happening. And that could change, it could demand a more diverse, again, it's how we define diverse, but that could well demand a more diverse group. And I think we're going to see younger directors, coming on board. And then you have to ask the question, is that going to affect term limits? Is that going to affect, because you don't want a director serving for 40 years,
Right.
As a director. They're not going to be very independent. But certainly complexity, is not going to go down in the short run. I guess that's maybe a good summary. This was going to be my favorite question for today, so I wanted to make sure that I passed this to you ahead of time. Sometimes I surprise my guests, but in this case, I didn't surprise you. But I wanted to ask if a board member, or maybe as you're writing something, in your later years, a publishing company comes up to you and says, outside of the obvious attributes like a director being ethical and a director being independent. With all the board members and companies that you've dealt with, what are the key attributes that make highly effective directors as far as your experience goes?
Well, that should be the key question. I'm glad you did save it for last, and it should be a favorite, because that should be the question for every corporate governance committee at the board level. What are they looking for as directors? And I would say that there are perhaps two attributes above all. One is intellectual integrity. You have to do, and this goes back to your very original question, what is right? You have to make that decision, and you've got to have the intellectual integrity not to compromise what you think is the correct answer for going along with whatever, whether it is the CEO or popular sentiment or how you're going to be portrayed in the press. You've got to be intellectually have the intellectual integrity. And then you have to balance two other elements. One is to be willing to be forthright, but balance that with the collegiality of a boardroom. A boardroom where the directors are clashing will be an ineffective board. That is, I think, inevitable, because too much time is wasted on infighting. No good decisions get made, bad decisions do get made, or no decisions get made, which leads to corporate paralysis. So being able, and it's a skill which only a relative handful of people have, is to be forthright and collaborative and collegial at the same time.
Well, and that, as far as I'm concerned, takes us full circle back to the board leadership, which these days is just so critical in my mind. If you don't have leadership, there's a very good chance you're going to have a dysfunctional board, even though you have very significant players participating. So
absolutely.
Well, Raj, I can't thank you enough for joining
with
us. It's a pleasure to have us have the opportunity to work together again. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show, and will join us again next week, where we'll look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.